Global Cooling, The Time Bubble Book 2. Written by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Ian Pringle. Global Cooling. Written by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Ian Pringle. Prologue. Astronomers had known about asteroid Apophis for nearly a quarter of a century. There was a minor panic back in 2004 when a news story broke claiming there was a 1 in 60 chance that it would hit Earth in 2029. These claims were soon discounted. It was categorically stated that the asteroid would miss Earth by a distance of 18,600 miles. This was a mere hair's breadth in astronomical terms, but far enough for the planet's inhabitants to breathe a collective sigh of relief. There was no need to disbelieve the claims of the astronomers. After all, the sun rose and set every day when it was supposed to. Tide tables could be calculated centuries in advance, as could solar eclipses. In short, the solar system was a very ordered and predictable place. Collisions with sizable asteroids were rare for modern Earth, unlike the early days of the planet, when huge objects crashed into the surface on a regular basis. In fact, Earth was living through a comparatively balmy period. There had been no catastrophic volcanic eruptions, ice ages, or major disasters of any kind for thousands of years. It was a major contributing factor as to why, after millions of years on the planet, humankind had made massive advances in an extremely short space of time. Technology now ruled supreme. Everything from communication to the food chain was completely automated, completely reliable, and extremely efficient. Apart from a few war-torn and famine-stricken areas, by 2029 the majority of the world's population led an extremely pampered and comfortable lifestyle. On the downside, the vast majority of that population possessed very few skills of their ancestors. They had no need to. Who needed to know how to mill wheat, fashion tools, or make a candle anymore? Such skills were no longer necessary. It was all done for us. Collectively, the human race knew how to do everything. Individually, they knew very little. The thought that basic services everyone took for granted, such as running water, electricity, and lightning-fast internet access, might one day not be available, never even crossed anyone's mind. If it had, they might have been better prepared for what was to come. But they had no reason to prepare. The astronomers had said Apophis would miss us, and the astronomers were never wrong. So people got on with their daily lives, and apart from a few cranks parading around with banners proclaiming the end of the world is nigh, the whole thing was pretty much ignored. The end of the world had been wrongly predicted countless times over the years. By now, everyone was completely blasé about such proclamations. Unfortunately, the astronomers hadn't taken into account a random element that could not possibly have been predicted. Out way beyond the solar system, millions of comets are ploughing lonely, long-term orbits which bring them close to the sun only very infrequently. The vast majority are unknown to astronomers and are only discovered when they approach the inner solar system and become visible. About 10 or so are discovered each year. In the spring of 2029, one such comet was heading towards the Sun after thousands of years in the cold outer reaches of the solar system. It was a relatively small comet, and wasn't even spotted until it had passed the orbit of Jupiter. By this time, it was only a few weeks from Earth. Its discovery went almost unnoticed by the general public to begin with. It wasn't until it came within a few days of Earth that it became visible to the naked eye. But there was nothing to worry about. Astronomers tracking its orbit noted that it would pass relatively close to Earth, but would miss us. But there was one crucial factor they had failed to notice, or if they had, they certainly hadn't let on to the rest of the world's population. The comet was on a collision course for asteroid Apophis, and that was about to change everything. Chapter 1. 12th of April, 2029, 9 a.m. As Charlie Adams drove into work on Thursday morning, he was in a happy and contented mood. The radio was playing an old noughties classic, the sun was shining, and it was already nearly 20 degrees Celsius. Such temperatures would have seemed remarkable at this time of year even a decade ago, but global warming had meant they had become the norm. With the driverless car handling all the hard work for him, he was able to sit back, relax, and enjoy the view. Life was good for Charlie. As the end of the decade approached, he had plenty of things to feel positive about. It was over 10 years now since he'd got together with his childhood sweetheart Kaylee, and they'd been inseparable ever since. Some had said that it wouldn't last, that they would grow apart when they went to university, but they got around that problem by going to the same one. Whilst Kaylee studied physics in pursuit of a career in meteorology, Charlie had taken a degree in business studies. After a year of sneaking in and out of each other's rooms at night, by their second year they had set up home together in a tiny flat in the Clifton area of Bristol. Combining studies with work in a pizza restaurant, they spent 3 blissfully happy years together. Once graduated, they returned to their hometown in Oxfordshire. Charlie went to work as a graduate trainee for a big marketing company in Oxford, while Kaylee was lucky enough to land a dream job with the Met Office. Although based in Exeter, huge advances in telecommunications allowed her, like most of the population, to work from home most of the time. The icing on the cake had come the previous summer, when they'd married in the very church they'd played Mary and Joseph in the school nativity play over 20 years ago. Now they lived in the modern house Charlie had once shared with his mother. She had begun a new relationship with Kaylee's father following his divorce. They had moved abroad to live in the Canary Islands, leaving Charlie and Kaylee to take over the family home. With a booming economy, good job prospects, and an increasingly agreeable climate, the future was looking bright. Had he known of the global events about to unfold, things would have seemed distinctly less rosy. But, like almost everyone else, he was blissfully unaware. He and Kaylee had been quite late getting to bed the previous evening. They had gone outside to get a glimpse of the amazingly bright new comet that had appeared in the night sky. Comets visible without a telescope were a rarity in the modern, brightly lit world, but this one was spectacular. The ball-shaped head had an impressive tail spread out behind it. Kaylee had remarked that it looked like a peacock strutting its feathers. Despite it being only early April, they had been quite able to sit comfortably on the patio and share a bottle of wine. The weather was so good that they were planning to invite their old friend Josh over for a barbecue at the weekend. Charlie didn't have to worry that the weather might turn. One advantage of having a wife who worked for the Met Office was that he had his own personal source of weather information to hand at all times. He was only a mile from his turning off the A34 when the traffic began slowing down. Despite huge improvements to the road system, smart, driverless cars, and more people than ever working from home, one thing never changed. The traffic around Oxford remained unremittingly awful. It was getting warm in the car. One downside of all the good weather was that wearing a suit and a tie every day could get quite uncomfortable during the warmer months. He looked in the mirror, noting small beads of sweat forming beneath his short, dark hair. His green eyes looked tired. He really ought to get to bed earlier in the evening and lay off the wine for a few days. The traffic continued to crawl along, and he knew he was late when the 9 a.m. news came onto the radio. Most days it wouldn't have mattered, but his boss insisted on the team having their Thursday morning huddle each week at 9:15. He'd be lucky if he could grab a coffee and get there on time now. Not that he was particularly bothered. The Thursday morning meetings were a tedious waste of time. He and his colleagues would sit in a room listening to the boss spouting endless marketing verbal diarrhea. Then they'd each have to report on the current sales position with their clients. The whole thing went on until at least 11 a.m., by which time Charlie was usually losing the will to live. The irony was that, whilst they were wasting time sitting in the conference room listening to the boss admonishing them for not hitting their sales targets, they could actually have been out there selling. As Charlie listened to the radio, the first couple of stories didn't make much of an impact on him. They weren't things that affected him directly. Had he known what lay ahead, he might have paid closer attention. The first story on the news was about how the last of Britain's nuclear power stations had been successfully shut down. Over the past decade, the government had pursued a relentless policy of sourcing energy from abroad whilst switching to renewable energy sources at home. Britain was now almost completely dependent on gas imported directly from Russia via a giant pipeline. There was more than enough to go around, There was a lot less energy being used in recent years than there had been in the past. A succession of exceptionally mild winters and warm summers had meant that the amount of heating needed for homes, shops, and workplaces had fallen dramatically. Global warming had been good for Britain. The temperature across the country as a whole was estimated to have risen by 2 degrees Celsius over the past 2 decades. It didn't sound a lot, but in practical terms, it was huge. Vineyards were springing up in southern England, the weather was warm from March to October, and the mood of the nation had improved as a whole. Of course, global warming was not good for many places in the world, and most people in Britain would adopt a politically correct front when the subject was brought up. "Oh, it's terrible about global warming," was a popular conversation opener. The reality was that most were secretly delighted about the long hours they could spend sitting in their deck chairs in their gardens soaking up the sun. They didn't even have to fly to Spain on holiday anymore. They could get all the sun they needed here. The fine weather had brought a renaissance to Britain's seaside towns, which holidaymakers flocked to once again after decades of decline. The people eased their conscience by giving generously to each new disaster fund, of which there were many. Devastating events such as Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 now happened with increasing regularity. Barely a week went past without news of some new natural disaster somewhere in the world. Typhoons, floods, and famines, once the exception, were now the norm. It was one such story that was the second item on the news bulletin. A tropical cyclone had made landfall in the Bay of Bengal, causing devastation and the estimated loss of thousands of lives. That this story was only considered important enough to be the second item on the news behind the power station story said it all. Such disasters were so commonplace now that they were barely considered even newsworthy. The average Brit's "I'm all right, Jack" attitude, while sticking a tenner in the charity bucket, would doubtless be extremely distressing to those in the disaster zones if they did but know. The news bulletin concluded, as always, with a light-hearted item. Today it was about the upcoming close pass of asteroid Apophis. This was something that Charlie was interested in, and he turned the radio up to catch the story. "Well, for those of you who were out last night comet spotting, I'm sure you'll know we've another heavenly object passing close by this week," gushed the newscaster rather over-enthusiastically. "It's not me, is it?" interrupted the somewhat egotistical breakfast DJ, who liked to consider himself something of a local sex symbol, despite the fact that none of the listeners did. "No, it's not you," continued the newscaster. "Now, I'm sure you'll be aware that tomorrow is Friday the 13th, unlucky for some, and we've got a great big asteroid heading our way. But there's no need to worry. It's going to miss us by at least 18,000 miles, so it'll be safe to get out of bed. And now, it's time for the weather. Here's Kaylee." One of Kaylee's jobs working for the Met Office was to provide weather bulletins for the local BBC station. Charlie smiled as he heard his wife's voice. "It'll be another fine and sunny day across Oxfordshire, with temperatures soaring to 25 degrees Celsius, well above the average for the time of year. Right now, here at our Oxford studios, it's 19 degrees Celsius. That's 66 Fahrenheit. "Thanks, Kaylee," remarked the DJ. "And I must say that's a gorgeous summery outfit you have on today. And now, here's an old classic from Pharrell Williams." Charlie had to chuckle at the DJ's inane attempt at flirting. He knew Kaylee couldn't stand him, and not only that, she was giving the weather forecast from home, so there was no way he could possibly know what she was wearing. What an idiot. Finally, the car turned into the car park. There weren't many spaces, but the car soon found one and positioned itself precisely between the painted white lines. It was 12 minutes past 9. If he hurried, he might just make it to the meeting on time. The sun bore down brightly from the clear blue sky as he made his way into the gleaming glass building. It was already feeling hot. Chapter 2, 12th of April, 2029, 11:30 a.m. Lauren Watson turned the key in the lock of the front door of the Red Lion and let herself in. It felt pleasantly cool in the old building as she walked across the large flagstones that led to the bar. Being rather diminutive in stature, she didn't have to worry about banging her head on the exposed wooden beams. They had caught out many an over-enthusiastic Friday night drinker, despite the mind-your-head notices attached to each one. Lauren enjoyed her life. With her pretty face, cheeky smile and low-cut bob of black hair, she had no problem attracting male attention. Working behind the bar, she got plenty of it. And that wasn't enough. She also ran 2 nights of entertainment in the pub, karaoke on Thursdays, and a Saturday night disco. She was the only female DJ in the town and had a never-ending string of admirers flocking around her at every gig. She rarely went home alone on those nights. Unlike Kaylee and Charlie, her best friends from school, she hadn't gone to university. Her boyfriend, Josh, had gone to read mathematics at Oxford, but after a year or so they split up. Their lives were moving in different directions, and she just couldn't get on with his college crowd. She returned to the town and tried a variety of jobs, hairdressing, shop work, beautician, but none of them really satisfied her. She was out drinking most nights and inevitably drifted into bar work after getting sacked from most of her other jobs. Getting into DJing was a lucky break. One night, the DJ the pub had hired to run the karaoke was so drunk he couldn't operate the equipment properly. Lauren, having attended enough karaoke nights to last a lifetime, knew enough about how it all worked to step into the breach and save the day. From then onwards, the job was hers. She was annoyed to see that the bar area had been left in a complete mess. There were empty glasses and crisp packets scattered everywhere, and also a large silver trophy on the bar with some sort of strange purple residue in the bottom of it. It stank of strong alcohol. No doubt the landlord and his friends had been up late drinking again. There was no sign that a cleaner had been in, and clearly no one from upstairs had been down yet either. Lauren sighed. She'd been looking forward to having an e-cig and a coffee before opening up the pub at midday. Now she was going to have to clear up the mess. She noticed that several fag butts had been chucked into the large, open fireplace in the wall opposite the bar, more evidence of an after-hours party. The fireplace was hardly ever used these days. It had been such a mild winter that most of the lorry load of logs that the landlord had ordered in for the season was still sitting in the car park. Despite the ever-increasing popularity of e-cigarettes, the older drinkers and hardened smokers in the pub still preferred their real fags, even at £20 per packet. The fact that the ends were in the fireplace was all the evidence needed for an after-hours party. It was strictly illegal when the pub was open. The back wall of the pub was completely dominated by a huge TV screen, a good 8 feet across, positioned above a stage. It was the latest in state-of-the-art entertainment, a holographic television which brought live sports action directly into the pub. She grabbed the remote from behind the bar and flicked it on. Unsurprisingly, it was tuned into the sports channel. She flicked it across to one of the commercial channels and started tidying up the mess. Someone was bound to ask to have the sport on once the pub was open, but she wasn't going to change it back until she had to. The door behind the bar that led upstairs to the private quarters swung open, and the landlord emerged, looking somewhat the worse for wear. He was overweight, untidy, and looked as if he'd gone to bed in the clothes he was wearing. Richard Kent was 52 years old and had been landlord of the Red Lion for 8 years. He was well known in the local area. For many years prior to taking over the pub, he'd been in charge of the local police force. Unfortunately, things had gone rather wrong for him after a botched case involving a missing girl, which he had called spectacularly wrong. After that, he was invited to retire quietly from the force on a very generous redundancy package. At first, he was quite unsure what to do with his newfound freedom, until his wife suggested that, as he spent so much time in the Red Lion, he might as well go and live there. He took her at her word, and with the old landlord selling up, seized his chance and bought the lease. Debbie, his long-suffering wife, was secretly rather pleased. She'd always wanted to run a restaurant, and the pub came complete with one attached. She took over the restaurant while Kent managed the pub side of things. This suited him rather well. He still had her close by to look after him and cook him his meals, but running the restaurant kept her out of his way most of the time. To say Kent was rather traditional in his attitude towards marriage would have been an understatement. "Morning, Lauren," he said. "Sorry about the mess. Had a bit of a late one last night with a few of the boys." "So I see," remarked Lauren. "I see the cleaners haven't been in again." "No, I was meaning to talk to you about that. We had a bit of a disagreement," said Kent. "What sort of disagreement?" she asked. "Well, basically, she wanted extra money for doing upstairs as well, and I said no, so she walked out." "So, are you going to get someone else?" asked Lauren. Well, the thing is, I was kind of hoping you might do it, suggested Kent tentatively. What? In addition to all the other things I do around here? Replied Lauren, feeling somewhat peeved. I more or less run this place single-handed for you these days as it is. Before Kent could reply further, the door opened behind him and Debbie emerged, looking none too pleased. Oh, there you are, she said, clearly on the warpath. What time did you get to bed last night? Oh, about 12:30, I think, replied Kent. And the rest, explained Debbie. I woke up about 2 a.m. and you weren't in bed, and I could hear a right racket coming from downstairs. I guess it could have been a bit later. The darts team had their last match of the winter season last night, and we were celebrating winning the league. I have to socialise with the regulars, my love. It's all part of the job. You practically are one of the regulars, she said. I sometimes think you forget which side of the bar you're meant to be on. There's no point owning a pub if you can't enjoy a couple of pints now and again, he replied. Pints? More like gallons, judging by this lot. Debbie glanced around the room. Lauren was keeping out of this conversation and tidying the place up, but it was obvious no cleaning had been done. Look at the state of the place, exclaimed Debbie. Why haven't the cleaners been in? It's all right. Lauren doesn't mind doing it, do you, Lauren? Replied Kent. Lauren's got enough to do, said Debbie, before Lauren had a chance to respond. I'm going to phone the cleaner and ask her why she hasn't come in. Ah, that might be a little awkward, said Kent, and he began to explain the situation. Lauren missed the rest of the conversation because she was interrupted by a loud banging on the front door. It was 12:02. Someone was eager. Come on, over and up, shouted a voice from outside. Lauren took the keys from the hook on the wall next to the till, crossed the stone floor, and opened the large wooden door. She already knew who it was going to be. He turned up as regular as clockwork at the same time every day. She opened the door, and standing in the doorway was the pub's resident alcoholic, unemployable waster, Andy Green. She noted he was wearing the same green jumper he had on all week, beneath the ancient denim jacket, which looked as if it was only held together by dirt. He already smelt of booze. No doubt he'd breakfasted at Ye Olde Chapel up the road, which opened at 9 a.m. Morning, Andy, she said. How are you today? All right, gorgeous, he replied. You're looking as hot as ever. Andy never stopped flirting with Lauren, and she played up to it a little, even though she wouldn't dream of sleeping with him in a million years. It was good for business to flirt with the customers, Kent had told her, so Andy remained ever hopeful. He'd heard other blokes in the pub saying that Lauren was an easy lay, and he figured it was bound to be his turn sooner or later. Andy was either the pub's best or worst customer, depending on how you looked at it. He was the best because he spent more money than anyone else. He was the worst because when he was drunk, he was a complete pain in the arse. Kent could only see the pound signs, though, where Andy was concerned. He had plenty of money. He'd inherited his sister's house when she died a couple of years ago, promptly sold it for £500,000 and moved into a rented bedsit. He'd been pissing away the proceeds ever since. He hadn't worked in years, and probably never would again. Lauren returned to the bar, where she caught the tail end of the conversation between Kent and his wife. Just you get on that phone, ordered Debbie, and tell her you'll pay her the extra money and to get herself down here tomorrow morning, and don't be so tight in the future. With that, she stormed back off upstairs. Lauren began pouring Andy his customary lager and looked up at the television screen. The midday news had come on, and the screen was showing some spectacular pictures of the new comet. Kent and Andy were oblivious to it. Kent was sitting at the bar, reading The Sun, whilst all Andy was interested in was getting his hands on his pint. She left them to it and went outside for a smoke. Chapter 3, 12th of April, 2029, 3:30 p.m. Kent and Andy may not have been interested in the comet, but there were plenty of people who were. Joss Gardner was just finishing giving his afternoon lecture. He'd been at Oxford University now for 9 years, a mathematical prodigy in his youth. He'd had no difficulty securing a place at one of Oxford's leading colleges. After that, he'd stayed on, done a PhD, and started lecturing. The money from his father's building firm had seen him comfortably through college, and he was now earning a good living from the university. All of this gave him the opportunity to pursue the thing he really wanted to do, Ever since his and Charlie's adventures with the time bubble all those years ago, he'd been fascinated by the whole concept of time travel. Since he'd been at the university, he'd made the acquaintance of Professor Anthony Hamilton. Anthony was an old school friend of Peter Grant's, Josh's time-travelling former English teacher. He'd confided in Anthony all about the time bubble, and the professor was only too happy to get Josh involved in his tachyon experiments. Between them, they'd built a device capable of detecting and measuring tachyon particles. They'd taken it to the railway tunnel where they discovered the time bubble, and the readings had gone off the scale as if they'd put a Geiger counter in a nuclear reactor. They had noted down detailed measurements of the speed of the particles in the bubble and discovered that they were moving at a pace many times faster than expected. By comparing these figures against normal particles in lab conditions, Josh had been able to correlate them against the length of time they knew Peter was in the bubble. Since then, Josh had had two things in mind. Firstly, what if there were more time bubbles out there? Could they track them down? He spent a lot of time searching the internet for clues to possible locations. He looked into planes and ships that had mysteriously vanished, never to be seen again. Closer to home, he looked for missing persons cases that had never been solved, tracing their last known movements to see if he could find any trace of tachyon activity. All had turned up blank so far, but he remained hopeful.